Some secrets survive because people never look in the right place. Others survive because they hide behind the last face anyone would ever question. For more than 30 years, one of America's most wanted killers lived in plain sight, surrounded by people who trusted him without hesitation. He wasn't constantly running from police, he wasn't hiding in abandoned buildings or changing identities. He simply woke up each morning and lived an ordinary life. He attended church services, greeted neighbors with quiet confidence, and returned home to the same family dinner table week after week. If investigators had walked past him on the street, they probably wouldn't have remembered his face. That was precisely what made him so dangerous. The mystery wasn't only how he committed his crimes, it was how he convinced an entire community that he was someone incapable of them. When the truth finally surfaced, the revelation didn't just solve a decades-old investigation, it forced countless people to question how well they really knew anyone. His name was Dennis Rader. But for years, America knew him only by 3 chilling letters that carried fear across an entire city: BTK. Long before those initials appeared in newspaper headlines, Wichita, Kansas was known as a quiet Midwestern city where routine shaped everyday life. Families left for work each morning believing they would return to the same peaceful neighborhoods they had always trusted. Children played outside until dusk. Front porches stayed occupied. Friendly conversations drifted across fences without much thought about personal safety. Violent crime certainly existed, but few residents imagined their community would become associated with one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations. That sense of normalcy would slowly begin to erode, not through public warnings or obvious threats, but through carefully planned violence hidden behind ordinary appearances. Whoever was responsible wasn't acting impulsively. Investigators would later discover someone patient, organized, and willing to wait for the right opportunity. Before detectives understood they were hunting a serial offender, individual tragedies unfolded that seemed impossible to connect into a larger pattern. Everything investigators learned in those early days came one piece at a time, often raising more questions than providing meaningful answers. On January 15, 1974, concern grew when members of the Otero family failed to answer calls or appear where they were expected. A relative eventually entered the Wichita home and discovered a scene that immediately suggested something far beyond an ordinary emergency. 4 members of the Otero family had been killed inside their own house, leaving investigators confronted with a deeply disturbing crime. The victims included Joseph and Julie Otero, along with 2 of their children, Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine. From the beginning, detectives recognized signs that these killings had involved planning rather than random violence. Certain details suggested the offender had spent time controlling the situation instead of acting quickly before escaping. That realization created an unsettling possibility. If someone had carefully planned these murders once, there was no guarantee they wouldn't do it again. Detectives interviewed neighbors, relatives, co-workers, and anyone connected to the family, searching for motives that might explain what had happened. They considered robbery, personal disputes, and family connections, but none of those possibilities fully explained the unusual circumstances surrounding the crime. As evidence accumulated, investigators struggled to identify a suspect who matched both the planning and the apparent confidence displayed during the attack. The investigation continued, but without a clear suspect, uncertainty settled over Wichita like an invisible weight. Families who had rarely locked their doors suddenly reconsidered everyday routines that once seemed perfectly safe. Conversations throughout the city increasingly centered on one unsettling question. Was this an isolated tragedy or the beginning of something far worse? Months passed before investigators received an answer, and it arrived in the form of another carefully planned attack. In April 1974, Catherine Bright became the next known victim after an attack inside her Wichita home. Her brother survived despite serious injuries, becoming one of the few people able to provide investigators with first-hand information about the offender. His account suggested a calm, deliberate attacker who appeared focused on maintaining control throughout the encounter. Although the description offered valuable insight, it still wasn't enough to identify the person responsible. Instead, detectives faced an increasingly troubling reality. Two separate crime scenes displayed similarities that were becoming difficult to ignore. The possibility of a serial killer operating inside Wichita could no longer be dismissed as unlikely. As investigators quietly compared evidence, fear spread much faster than confirmed information ever could. Residents adjusted routines, businesses discussed additional precautions, and local conversations reflected a growing sense that someone dangerous remained unidentified. Yet somewhere within that same community, the offender continued living an outwardly ordinary existence without attracting meaningful suspicion. He wasn't isolated from society, he blended into it, moving through daily life alongside the very people searching for answers. Investigators still didn't know his name, his occupation, or what connected him to the victims. What they did know was becoming increasingly clear. Whoever they were hunting possessed patience, confidence, and remarkable self-control. Those qualities made him unusually difficult to predict, leaving detectives uncertain about where he might strike next. Then, before investigators could identify him, the unknown offender made a decision that changed the investigation in an entirely unexpected way. Instead of remaining invisible, he reached out, determined that the city would finally know the name he had chosen for himself. Early in 1974, a handwritten message was discovered inside a public library book, waiting quietly for someone who would eventually understand its significance. The letter described the Otero family murders and claimed responsibility in language investigators immediately recognized as coming from someone intimately familiar with the crime. This wasn't a confession driven by remorse. It was a calculated attempt to control the narrative surrounding the investigation. The writer wanted recognition almost as much as he wanted secrecy, creating a contradiction that would define the case for decades. Near the end of the message, he proposed a name that he believed captured the method behind his crimes. 3 words: bind, torture, kill. From that moment forward, the unknown offender became known simply as BTK. The initials spread quickly through newspapers and television broadcasts, transforming an unidentified criminal into a frightening public figure without revealing his identity. Ironically, the man hiding from police had now given himself a name that would become infamous across the United States. Investigators examined every sentence, searching for handwriting characteristics, phrasing, or hidden clues that might reveal the author's identity. The letters demonstrated organization and confidence, but they revealed frustratingly little about the person who had written them. Meanwhile, BTK remained exactly where detectives least expected him, living an ordinary life that attracted almost no attention. The investigation expanded rapidly as detectives compared reports, interviewed additional witnesses, and reviewed evidence with renewed urgency. Yet despite growing public awareness, the case refused to move in a straightforward direction. Months later, another attack reinforced investigators' fears that the killer had no intention of stopping voluntarily. On October 4, 1974, 21-year-old Catherine Bright's case was no longer the latest tragedy haunting Wichita. Shirley Vian was attacked inside her own home while her young children were present, though they survived physically unharmed. The crime deeply unsettled investigators because it demonstrated the offender's willingness to enter occupied homes during daylight hours. He wasn't simply choosing isolated locations, he appeared confident entering familiar neighborhoods where discovery was always possible. Each attack suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence, making his movements increasingly difficult to anticipate. Detectives studied maps, searching for geographic patterns that might reveal where the offender lived or worked. Patterns emerged, but none pointed clearly toward a single suspect or neighborhood. As weeks became months, BTK remained unidentified, despite one of the largest criminal investigations Wichita had ever undertaken. The city learned to live with uncertainty, but uncertainty rarely stays quiet for long. In 1977, another attack reminded everyone that the danger had never truly disappeared. Nancy Fox was found dead inside her apartment after failing to appear for work, prompting another intensive investigation. The similarities to earlier crimes immediately drew detectives back toward the same disturbing conclusion. Whoever had murdered the Otero family years earlier had almost certainly returned. This time, however, investigators received something they had never expected. Shortly after the crime, BTK personally contacted emergency services, directing authorities to Nancy Fox's residence. The brief phone call contained little information beyond the location, yet its significance was enormous. It confirmed the killer's continuing need to involve himself in the investigation, even when remaining silent would have been far safer. For detectives, every communication represented both an opportunity and a frustration. Each message hinted at the person behind BTK, but never enough to identify him conclusively. Behavioral experts studied his writings, hoping language might reveal education, occupation, personality, or age. Some observations proved useful, but none could substitute for physical evidence connecting a suspect to the crimes. The investigation increasingly relied on patience, knowing one overlooked detail might eventually unlock the entire case. Meanwhile, BTK appeared remarkably disciplined, avoiding the careless mistakes that often expose repeat offenders. Years passed, and investigators noticed another unusual pattern beginning to emerge. Unlike many serial offenders, BTK didn't attack at predictable intervals. Long periods of silence separated confirmed murders, making it difficult to anticipate when or if another crime might occur. That inconsistency complicated every aspect of the investigation, from surveillance planning to public safety recommendations. Then, in 1978, BTK sent another letter to local media, ensuring his name remained impossible to forget. The communication reinforced what investigators already suspected. Recognition mattered deeply to him. Remaining anonymous wasn't enough. He wanted the city to remember BTK, even if nobody recognized Dennis Rader. While detectives searched endlessly for the man behind those letters, he quietly continued building a respectable life that seemed completely beyond suspicion. By the early 1980s, something unusual happened. The murders stopped, but investigators couldn't say whether the threat had truly disappeared. Without new crime scenes to examine, the investigation entered unfamiliar territory, chasing memories instead of fresh evidence. The passing years created an uncomfortable possibility. Had BTK left Wichita forever, or was he simply choosing not to kill? Detectives considered every explanation they could justify through evidence, but none fully answered the silence that had settled over the case. Some believed the killer might have died, others wondered whether he had been imprisoned for an unrelated crime. There was another possibility investigators couldn't dismiss. BTK might still be living quietly in Wichita, waiting without attracting attention. That idea was perhaps the most unsettling because it meant the city's greatest mystery could be walking its streets every day. Unknown to investigators, Dennis Rader wasn't hiding from society. He was becoming more deeply involved in it. He had served in the United States Air Force before returning to civilian life, eventually settling into steady employment. He married Paula Dietz, and together they raised 2 children, building the image of an ordinary American family. Friends and neighbors described him as dependable, reserved, and someone who preferred structure over unnecessary attention. Nothing about his daily routine suggested investigators were unknowingly searching for a man much closer than they imagined. Dennis Rader wasn't living on society's margins. He was participating in it with remarkable consistency. He became active at Christ Lutheran Church, eventually serving in leadership roles that reflected the trust others placed in him. Week after week, fellow church members saw a man committed to faith, family, and community responsibility. Parents also knew him through Cub Scouts, where he volunteered as a leader and interacted with local families. These public roles strengthened his reputation, making him appear increasingly unlikely to become the focus of any criminal investigation. Later, he accepted a position with the City of Park City as a compliance officer responsible for enforcing municipal ordinances. The job brought him into neighborhoods throughout the community, addressing complaints involving animals, property maintenance, and local regulations. Residents sometimes found him strict or uncompromising, but few viewed those traits as anything beyond professional dedication. To investigators, Dennis Rader remained invisible because they had no reason to connect his respectable public life with BTK. As technology gradually advanced, detectives revisited old evidence using newer forensic methods unavailable during the original investigations. DNA analysis offered fresh possibilities, but only if investigators could eventually compare existing evidence with the right individual. Without a viable suspect, even the most advanced forensic science had practical limits. The BTK investigation slowly became one of Wichita's longest-running unsolved cases, remaining open despite years without significant progress. New detectives inherited boxes of reports, photographs, and evidence collected by investigators who had devoted years to finding answers. Every generation of detectives believed the next overlooked detail might finally identify the person hiding behind the BTK letters. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader continued attending church services, community meetings, and family events without attracting meaningful suspicion. His neighbors didn't see a fugitive living next door. They saw someone who appeared remarkably ordinary. That ordinary appearance became one of his greatest protections, allowing assumptions to shield him more effectively than disguises ever could. As the years passed, public attention naturally shifted toward newer cases capturing national headlines. For many outside Kansas, BTK gradually became another infamous mystery that might never reach a conclusion. The families of the victims, however, never had the luxury of moving on so completely. Questions left unanswered continued to shape lives long after newspaper coverage had faded. Who was responsible? Where had he gone? And why had the murders suddenly stopped? Those questions lingered through the 1980s and into the 1990s, resisting every investigative effort to resolve them. By then, Dennis Rader had successfully balanced two completely separate identities for decades without exposing either to the other. One identity belonged to a husband, father, church leader, and municipal employee, admired by many who knew him personally. The other existed only in police files, forensic evidence, and haunting letters signed with 3 unforgettable initials. The remarkable part wasn't simply that both identities existed, it was that they never appeared to collide. For more than 20 years, BTK remained silent, leaving investigators with little reason to believe they would ever hear from him again. Silence, however, can become difficult to maintain when recognition begins to fade. As media attention shifted toward newer criminal cases, BTK's place in public memory gradually began slipping away. For someone who had repeatedly sought acknowledgement through letters and messages, being forgotten may have become increasingly difficult to accept. Then, after decades without contact, the man who had hidden so successfully made a decision that investigators had quietly hoped for, but never truly expected. In 2004, nearly 30 years after the first murders, BTK unexpectedly reached out again, ending one of the longest periods of silence in the investigation. His renewed communications weren't prompted by new evidence or mounting police pressure. They appeared to reflect something far more personal. The man who had once terrified Wichita no longer wanted to remain a forgotten mystery buried inside old case files. Letters, packages, and messages began arriving once more, carefully prepared and unmistakably familiar to investigators who remembered BTK's earlier communications. Detectives immediately recognized an opportunity they hadn't possessed for decades. The killer had voluntarily reopened contact. Every envelope, every page, and every object was examined using forensic techniques unavailable during the 1970s. Unlike the earlier investigation, advances in DNA testing, digital analysis, and evidence processing offered possibilities that hadn't existed when BTK first appeared. Even so, identifying the sender remained frustratingly difficult. He continued revealing just enough to command attention while protecting his identity. As months passed, BTK grew increasingly confident that he still controlled the pace of the investigation. Then he asked investigators an unusual question that would become one of the most consequential decisions of his life. He wanted to know whether information stored on a floppy disk could be traced back to its owner. Police understood the significance immediately. Rather than refusing to answer, they chose a strategy designed to encourage further communication. Investigators indicated that a floppy disk could not be traced in a way that would identify him. BTK believed the response. After avoiding detection for decades, he decided to trust the very people trying to arrest him. When the floppy disk arrived, forensic specialists examined far more than the visible files stored inside. Hidden digital metadata revealed information the sender never intended investigators to see. One clue pointed toward Christ Lutheran Church, where the disk had been used on a church computer. Another digital record contained a username that investigators quickly recognized as potentially significant. For the first time in decades, detectives weren't studying an anonymous offender. They were examining a real person's identity. The trail led them to Dennis Rader, a respected church leader whose public life appeared completely incompatible with the crimes. Investigators resisted making assumptions. Digital evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed independent proof before taking the extraordinary next step. Surveillance quietly began while detectives assembled every available piece of evidence linking Rader to the BTK investigation. They also obtained a DNA sample through lawful investigative means and compared it with biological evidence preserved from the crime scenes. The comparison produced what investigators had pursued for more than 30 years. The evidence was consistent with Dennis Rader. On February 25, 2005, officers stopped Dennis Rader while he was driving near his home in Park City, Kansas. As he was taken into custody, the city's greatest unsolved mystery suddenly became something entirely different, a case with a name and a face. News of the arrest spread rapidly, leaving neighbors, co-workers, church members, and friends struggling to reconcile two completely different versions of the same man. Many who knew Dennis Rader described overwhelming disbelief that someone they had trusted could also be BTK. The contradiction that opened this documentary now confronted an entire community with undeniable reality. The investigation had identified the suspect. The next challenge was proving decades of crimes beyond reasonable doubt. Faced with the evidence gathered against him, Dennis Rader eventually entered guilty pleas to multiple counts of first-degree murder. During court proceedings, he described his actions in a calm, matter-of-fact manner that many observers found deeply unsettling. His statements confirmed details investigators had spent decades piecing together through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and careful analysis. For the victims' families, the proceedings brought answers to questions that had remained unresolved for a generation. Those answers, however, could never erase the lives permanently altered by crimes committed many years earlier. Dennis Rader received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The BTK investigation officially came to an end, but public fascination with the case never truly disappeared. Criminologists continue studying the investigation because it demonstrates how outward appearances can complicate even the most determined police work. The case also reflects the dramatic impact of advancing forensic science, particularly digital evidence and modern DNA analysis. Had BTK never resumed communicating, investigators might have waited much longer before identifying the man responsible. Instead, one decision driven by misplaced confidence accomplished what decades of searching could not. Dennis Rader carefully concealed his identity for more than 30 years, yet ultimately placed investigators on the path to finding him. The BTK case remains disturbing not simply because of the crimes, but because of the ordinary life that successfully concealed them for so long. It reminds us that some investigations are solved through relentless persistence, evolving technology, and the unexpected choices made by those trying hardest to remain hidden. If this documentary gave you a deeper understanding of the BTK investigation, share your thoughts respectfully below. Subscribe for more carefully researched historical crime documentaries, and let us know which real case we should explore next.